everybody. Well, today's the last day of our wonderful journey, and I've really enjoyed. I always enjoy this journey just tremendously. And this is the first time I've virtually duplicated my reading schedule, my syllabus. You know, 'cause after all these times of teaching this class, I finally felt like I hit on something that worked pretty well, and I was comfortable with standing behind the syllabus and every part of this journey that we've been on. And anyway, I don't know why I put that up there. I encountered an article the other day that was talking about Sheldon Wolin, and I think I misidentified him as a political scientist. He was actually a philosopher, a social political philosopher. And he's the guy that coined this term inverted totalitarianism to describe the government, political, economic system that we have in the United States of America, inverted totalitarianism. And I just came across this one passage in this essay about Sheldon Wolin's idea that applied to natural resources. And lo and behold, you know, there you see it, right? Every natural resource, every living being is commodified and exploited to collapse. Exploited to collapse. As the citizenry is lulled and manipulated into surrendering their liberties and their participation in government through excess consumerism and sensationalism. Consumerism and sensationalism. The Romans, of course, were into sensationalism. I mentioned those Atlas bears that the Roman troops put so much pressure upon over the years, over the centuries, that they eventually went extinct. To use in their spectacles, right? Their sensationalistic spectacles, where prisoners were condemned to die by a starving bear. But anyway, the only bear and that was hardly considered, really, probably not considered at all by the Romans. Not considered at all. The only bear in Africa, the lone representative of the bear community that, you know, established himself or herself in the continent of Africa and went extinct eventually in the middle of the 19th century through hunting and habitat destruction. But if it hadn't been for the Romans putting centuries and centuries of pressure on these poor animals, kidnapping them and using them in their spectacles, then they would not be extinct today. And today, of course, you know, we have all this consumerism and sensationalism in different forms that's distracting us from this vast Holocaust. Really, Holocaust means throwing whole into the fire, right? Throwing whole into the fire. Literally, that's what that means. And that's what we seem to be doing to our Mother Earth and to all of her communities and species and ecosystems. Anyway, we have a lot of material we could get through today. We also have our final exam projects that we have to talk about today, and we also have our I guess my backpack is in the back of the room still, but we also have our course evaluations to do today. So I don't know really if I should do. I'm worried about getting bogged down. If you have not, well, let's just get started in our lecture material for today, and then let's just set aside a bunch of time, see how far we get with our material, and then set aside a bunch of time for talking about those of you who, and anybody who is dedicated, committed to doing the written take-home final exam, can of course, is more than welcome to show up on the day of the final exam. You know, you can bring your take-home final exam with you and just hand it in that way, or you can email it to me. But whatever you do, you're more than welcome to show up at 10 a.m. next Thursday, a week from today. And be a member of the public, right? Be an audience member to witness this hearing about the future of our 4 lower snake dams. And I sent out information to everybody about an hour, maybe 2 hours ago. More detailed. I finally sat down and did the work that I should have done a couple of weeks ago, quite honestly. But I have a schedule, an outline of, and for some reason I've never gotten around to showing the, have I? Footage, final fishing season at Celilo Falls, and I'll just maybe just let this play and background, maybe adjust the lights a little bit. Oops, sorry. Not that far, really. Not that far from Portland. Hour and 15 minutes or so. Drive up Highway 84. Just go east through the gorge. This was at the upper end of the gorge. Basically, if you're heading downriver on the Columbia River, this is the beginning of the Columbia Gorge. Heading downriver, and then there might be a little bit of gentle water a couple miles below here, but after that, it's pretty much all white water all the way through the gorge. And hundreds of fishing sites. Lewis and Clark probably undercounted, but they noticed at least 454 different fishing stations like these, all along the Columbia Gorge, along the Columbia River. They say, historically, this is where the river turned on its edge, right? The river is flowing along nice, pretty wide, and then it reaches the gorge, and it has this narrow channel it has to get through, so it kind of turns on its edge. It becomes really wild and free, or it's always free, right? But it becomes really wild and raging, and it restricts the movements of adult salmon who are migrating upstream, right? It forces them to follow certain well-established channels to get up past all the white water, right? And people who observed the river were aware, after many years, figured out that they have to go a certain way, and so they would build these platforms, right? And that's where all these traditional fishing stations are built, along places where the salmon have to go, right? And they're much easier to harvest right there. So Celilo Falls was the most famous, but before the Dalles Dam was completed in 1957, there were hundreds of other relatively famous, not as famous, but fairly famous fishing sites along the Cascades. A 40-mile section of the river, basically, between Celilo Falls and where Bonneville Dam now stands. This is where all these famous historic fishing stations were located. And in any event, I think this is an important part of the larger narrative about natural resources in the Pacific Northwest. And although the focus today is on our spawning and rearing habitats for these animals that these men are catching, right, in the Snake River, right, on the western slope of the Colorado Rockies, lots and lots of really rich spawning and rearing habitat for these salmon, right, and that's why we talked about those four lower snake dams. The one action we could take as a society to dramatically improve the chances of our Columbia Basin salmon runs is removal of those four lower snake dams. That's why we talk about it, right? But we're talking about spawning and rearing habitat, right? And here we're talking about harvest habitat, right? Harvest places. And the salmon ecosystem was a whole cycle, right? And these humans were an essential part of that cycle. Not these humans, but humans in general. Humankind was an essential part of this cycle. And so if we want to talk about restoring the salmon cycle as a whole, then probably we should include in that discussion not only restoration of the spawning and rearing habitats on the western slope of the Colorado Rockies, but we probably should also talk about restoration of the harvest sites that have been relied upon for at least 15,000 years by the indigenous people of this area. And perhaps, this is maybe kind of an unfamiliar and kind of exotic argument, but perhaps, and I think this is the kind of point that an environmental pragmatist or Thomas Birch would make. Restoration of the possibility of deontic experience is crucial to rehabilitation of 21st century environmental movements, all right? Restoration of the possibility of deontic experience. And so of all the places we could think about restoring, right? Perhaps Thomas Birch, an environmental pragmatist, would say that those places which we should focus on are the ones where, the ones at the intersection of culture and nature, where the possibility of deontic experience is most evident, right? And perhaps, so from that standpoint, right, restoring the harvest sites from a consequentialist, right, from the dominant worldview of consequentialist environmentalism, it seems like restoration of Celilo Falls is lower on the list of priorities, right? Restoration of the spawning and rearing habitats is higher, right? Much higher because, right? Because we want to restore the species. We want to allow the species to rebuild itself. And if we restore the harvest sites, what on earth is that going to do, right? We want to encourage more harvest? No, let's just restore the spawning and rearing habitats, right? But the point is that perhaps from an environmental pragmatist, perhaps even from a deep ecology point of view, the human role in the ecosystem is equally important. And reconnection of that human role. This is where one place, one bright, bright place where culture intersected with nature. Okay? And so perhaps from a deep ecology, from an environmental pragmatist, from an ecofeminist point of view, from the point of view of Thomas Birch, who thinks that restoring the possibility of deontic experience to, right, the experience of that which we must do to things which we're not necessarily familiar with anymore, right? We're not familiar with duties to salmon because the salmon are gone, right? But perhaps the idea is that if we restore the places where humans interacted with salmon, then that deontic experience of that which we must do will be renewed, right? And that's kind of the renewal of ecology within ourselves, right? Within the human psyche, within the human spirit. The renewal of ecology, renewal of these relationships, right? So although it seems, like perhaps it's not a priority for environmentalists, right? And certainly from a classical 20th century environmentalist point of view, it isn't a priority. Because it's not classical wilderness, right? Is it? It's only 70 miles from an urban center, 70 miles from Portland. And there is evidence of heavy, heavy industrial human usage all around, right? And so it's not a pretty place out in the middle of nowhere, like Dinosaur National Monument or Grand Canyon or many of the other focal points of 20th century of conservation, right? That's what the conservationists are interested in, preserving the pretty places. This was a pretty place, but it's not untrammeled by man. It's not out in the middle of nowhere, okay? So conservationists let it go, right? Even while they were rallying to defeat the two dams in northeastern Utah, right? Those two dams that were going to be part of the Upper Colorado River Basin Storage Project were defeated by this big environmental movement in the mid-1950s, right? The end result of that whole controversy was the construction of Glen Canyon Dam, which was even worse. And I could easily get sidetracked into a discussion of Glen Canyon Dam, but I'm not sure if I will. I might allow myself at some point here. But while that was going down, the Dalles Dam was being built, right? While environmentalists were saving Dinosaur National Monument and those pristine water, wild desert kind of landscape of the of the Green River. That's on the Green River that flows into the Colorado, right? And they had proposed these two dams. They were defeated, right? It was a big environmental victory. And yet even while that was going down in 1955, the Army Corps of Engineers was about to complete the Dalles Dam, right? And so evidently the Dalles Dam was not viewed as any kind of threat, any kind of challenge by the conservation community, right? Because it wasn't untrammeled by man, it was nearby. And the conservationist, the Pinchot Group A conservationist arguments for developing that section of the river were culturally so strong, right? And then these biologists were telling us naively and stupidly that we could have fish in power too, right? And so all these different cultural elements went into what eventually happened to our river, right? Into our historic fishing sites. So let's see. But, you know, to wrap that up and to explain perhaps in a little more carefully, philosophically, why I and other environmentalists believe that Celilo Falls is a very important, ought to be an important concern for Northwest environmentalists. The idea behind that is, you know, it's not as clear and evident and intuitive as the idea behind restoring our spawning and rearing habitats for Snake River salmon, right? That's obvious, right? We need biological space for this amazing resource to duplicate itself every year, right? And to get stronger, right? So we got to take out those 4 lower Snake dams, restore the flow, the natural flow regime of the lower Snake River and its tributaries, and that way restore a whole bunch of spawning habitat in the main stem of the Snake River itself, right? And a whole bunch of other tributaries. Restore a whole bunch of actual habitat where these animals are born and grow, right? Whereas, you know, if you're an environmentalist and you're talking about the places where humans harvest them, that seems a lot less important, doesn't it, than the places where the salmon are born and where they grow, right? So let's focus on restoring the Snake River, you know, and let's not restoring, right, part of the Snake River, right? And let's not be so concerned about Celilo. But perhaps the response to that is that salmon are a cultural resource. And if we can restore that section of the river where culture and nature came together in the most dramatic fashion, right, as we just saw in our video. That was the last fishing season at Celilo Falls. In the fall, right, fishing, the main fishing season. They fished there year-round. You know, and there were several kind of, you know, peaks, but the biggest peak of fishing season was in August, September, maybe early October, right? The water level was not too high, not too low. It was just right, and anyway, and that's what we saw. The last main fishing season in the late summer, early fall of 1956, and then on March 10th of 1957, the gates of the Dalles Dam were closed, and within about 5 or 6 hours, the river backed up high enough to cover the falls. And that was the end of the falls, right? The temporary end of the falls. The falls are still underneath the water and could be brought back, although bringing back the falling water by lowering the Dalles Reservoir is, of course, not exactly the same and not even close to the same as restoring Celilo Falls, because the salmon, right? I mean, Celilo Falls includes all of the ecological communities that were featured there. It's said that probably salmon nowadays, the Columbia Snake River salmon nowadays are genetically weaker and might even have a hard time, might even not be able to get over the falls. So in that event, that's true, restoring the falls would be detrimental. You know, anyway, obviously it's a big controversy. But so let's see how much we can get through. But that's why, right? I come from an environmental pragmatist point of view, and I come from the point of view, even though Thomas Birch doesn't self-identify as an environmental pragmatist, if anything, he kind of self-identifies as a Buddhist, believe it or not. As a couple of you were insightful enough to observe or to mention in your summaries of Thomas Birch. But he's coming from kind of an Eastern philosophical tradition, really, which is not that far away, actually, from an environmental pragmatist tradition. But the restoration of deontic experience is key, right? That's what Thomas Birch thinks we need to be doing as committed environmentalists. We need to be committed to the restoration of those places which invite humans to care about land, air, water, wildlife, right? And this place, Celilo Falls, arguably does that to perfection. Just absolute perfection. And remember, this was the most popular tourist destination in the Pacific Northwest until the day it was flooded. So it would make sense that, anyway. All right, it's a bit of a strange argument perhaps, but it's one that I'll stand behind from an environmental pragmatist, from a social ecology point of view too, right? Certainly social ecologists would have a great deal to say about what happened when Shiloh Falls was submerged, right? And the power of the river was transformed from a power to produce fish for the people who had been there for at least 15,000, probably closer to 40 or 50,000 years, right? The power of the river to provide their needs, to answer, to satisfy their moral claims was abruptly shifted to the power of the river to satisfy the moral claims of what at that time was the mainstream, and still is, admittedly, the mainstream U.S. American society, right? Right? And of course, social ecologists would have a field day over that transfer of power, right? We're transferring the power of the river to serve indigenous people through the natural production of meat, right? Of food in the watershed. Transferring that power to the harvest of kilowatts, right? The production of electricity, which served an entirely different sector of the population, the non-indigenous population. In any event, there's a reminder, this is how our friends who manage natural resources in the United States of America still think. Now I realize this is probably a 100-year-old quote, right? So I shouldn't be so bold as to say this is how they still think. Fortunately, they have evolved also, but this crystallizes the underlying philosophy, right, of hydro development. Every drop of water, right, according to this point of view, anthropocentric utilitarian point of view, every drop of water doesn't achieve its proper destiny, shall we say, unless it's used by human beings, right? There can be no full conquest of the earth and no real satisfaction to humanity if large portions of the earth remain beyond his highest control. So it's, the director of the Bureau of Reclamation, I was just trying to think of his name and I couldn't, so, man, he led the Bureau of Reclamation for 40 years, and he's featured in a pretty famous book. I forget his name now. Darn it, anyway. But the Bureau of Reclamation is responsible for building Glen Canyon Dam and for building we have Lake Powell, which is behind Glen Canyon Dam, and then we have Lake Mead, which is behind the dam that's below the Grand Canyon, right? And we have the Grand Canyon right in between on the Colorado River, right? And anyway, what's his name?
Oh, I have no idea. I was just going to say at the end, is he saying that we could feed ourselves on less dry areas of this country? Just do farming there, but really just because we can, we shouldn't? Is that what the last sentence is?
The United States might accommodate its present population within its humid region, but it would not then be the great nation that it now is. We need to turn. Something that perhaps, I don't know, you guys don't learn anything in high school anymore, right? But normally in high school you'd learn that the whole western 2/3 of the United States of America and Canada is a very arid region, with a couple of exceptions, right? The Wasatch area, the Wasatch Mountains provide, some attraction to, and they have considerable rain in portions of Utah, right? Which is probably why a lot of Mormons, ended up there. People who knew what was going on thought, okay, they got water there. And then on the west, right, in the Willamette Valley and west of the Cascade Range and west of the Sierra Nevada, there is enough rainfall to support agriculture without irrigation, right? But every other part of North America, west of the 98th parallel, is so dry that you need irrigation in order to grow any crops there. And so the function of the Bureau of Reclamation, as some people call it, is to develop water resources so that we can irrigate this incredibly dry part of our country and make the desert bloom, right? And use it for human exploitation and wealth creation, right? So that's what they're saying. That's what this Whitstow guy is saying. The destiny, right? And note the teleological language, okay? Whenever you hear words about the destiny of humankind, you know you're dealing with a natural law argument, right? A teleological argument whereby a normative claim, we should subject the whole earth to control by man, is justified with reference to the purpose of man, right? The purpose of man is a very high, lofty purpose. Look at our culture, our Beethoven and our Justin Bieber, right? Excuse me. Right? And so we have to serve that purpose, and we have the technology, and so we must use this technology, and we must build this incredible dam in Glen Canyon. Amazing dam, right? So much water is being held back that you'd think it would crumble any possible human creation, right? I mean, literally, so billions of tons of water is being held by this. So what do? They make it in an arch like that. Absolutely brilliant. Brilliant! Go check it out. You have to admire these humans for doing these amazing things, right? But they're able to, but what's happening is that both Lake Mead and Lake Powell, right? Lake Mead is below Grand Canyon on the Colorado River. Lake Powell is above, right? Glen Canyon forms Lake Powell, the reservoir. They're both way down. Way down. The reservoir, first of all, it took 19 years for the reservoir in Lake Powell behind the Glen Canyon Dam to fill. It took 19 years, right? Just for it to fill up. And that happened like 30 years ago, right? And ever since then, though, it's been going down. And experts, scientific enlightenment experts, have identified the source of the problem. Two sources. Big source is massive amounts of evaporation, right? Because the surface of Lake Powell is so huge that literally millions and trillions of gallons are being evaporated up into the sky in this desert, right? Every year. But not only that, a whole bunch of water is sinking down into the desert below this, right, at the floor, at the lake floor, the reservoir floor. And so the idea, amazingly, is that if we just consolidate the two reservoirs, they're both way below half full, right? They're way down. And so let's just eliminate, we don't have to take the dam out, we can leave it all in place, but restore that section of the Colorado River to its natural flow regime, right? Let the river return to its natural flow rate through Glen Canyon, which would mean allowing all those beautiful slot canyons and all those beautiful places that were flooded, right, when they built that dam, to re-emerge, which would be wonderful, and that's what environmentalists have been calling for all this time, right? But from a utilitarian, anthropocentric, let's make the most use of the river point of view, it turns out that might be a wise thing to do. Not because of the slot canyons and the beauty and all this stuff that environmentalists talk about, but because we're going to save a bunch of water. All that water that's lost to evaporation and that sinks below the floor of the reservoir is now going to be allowed to pass through the Grand Canyon and be collected in Lake Mead, below it, right? Way down there. So that's okay, right? And now we're getting better use of the river. Isn't that interesting? So there's serious talk of restoring. They're not talking about restoring, right? That's the effect, though. The effect would be to restore Glen Canyon, which would be absolutely awesome. David Brower, the long-term executive director of the Sierra Club, identified that as his greatest mistake. When he compromised, he's the guy that proposed Glen Canyon Dam as a compromise to avoid flooding Dinosaur National Monument. There were two dams proposed in that area of northeastern Utah, right, that would have flooded Dinosaur. So David Brower organized the whole Sierra Club response to condemn that. And one of the tools that he took out was this compromise, which resulted in Glen Canyon Dam, which he identified as the greatest mistake of his professional life, right? Agreeing to that compromise. So now, though, they're talking about, right, taking an action which David Brower and his followers would also and will, if it happens, they will celebrate. They will have huge parties. They will be so happy. And the first, right, sign up for the first river rafting trip that goes through, right, when that's all restored, right? So policy-wise, it's a great celebration, right? But from a deep ecological standpoint, from a meta-ethical, metaphysical standpoint, it's not really, it wouldn't really be, because the decision, if it's made on those lines, would only be made for utilitarian anthropocentric reasons, and it would not reflect the kind of studied decision that society ought to make from the radical environmentalist point of view, right? You see that, right? It turns out that if they do restore Glen Canyon, the way I've just suggested, it will be only because anthropocentric utilitarian calculations have done this cost-benefit analysis and determined that we would save so much water, right, by letting the river flow down into Lake Mead. We would save so much water that it makes a lot more sense, right, to do that than it makes to keep the two reservoirs the way they are. Kind of interesting, isn't it? But anyway, there's a lot of really, really interesting history, environmental history, in the southwestern part of the United States. The founder of the U.S. Geological Survey is a man named John Wesley Powell, who was a major, I believe, in the Civil War, fought for the Union, lost his right arm in the Civil War, but went on to survey the whole Colorado River area, and was the first guy with his crew to float a boat all the way down, all the way through the Grand Canyon. It's amazing that they even survived. But anyway, he was in favor of water resource policies organized around local control around watersheds. He actually put together a famous watershed map of the United States, John Wesley Powell did, whereby he redrew the boundaries of all 50 states to correspond to watershed boundaries. It's kind of interesting. Look up John Wesley Powell's watershed map of the United States. So, you know, people were thinking, this was right 150 years ago. This was in the middle of the 19th century, right? He made his amazing journey down the Colorado River, I think, in 1872 or something, right? Shortly after, and that is a nice segue. Because guess who wrote the definitive biography of John Wesley Powell and the definitive account of that journey down the Colorado River? Guess who? Who?
Leopold?
No, not Leopold. Leopold went down the Colorado with his brother, I think, in around 1905, and he documented the amazing wildlife and ecosystems at the mouth of the Colorado. And it's just heartbreaking. If you don't want your heart to be broken about how much has been lost, then don't